Welcome to Mintel's Little Conversation podcast.
Welcome to Mintel's Little Conversation, where our experts bring you fresh ideas and new perspectives on how consumers eat, drink, shop, groom and think. I'm your host, Andrew Davidson, based in New York. And today we will be discussing consumers' changing attitudes and expectations when it comes to the topic of sustainability. In light of everything else that is dominating the news cycle right now, from inflation to the war in Ukraine, what is the consumer mindset when it comes to this critical topic, and how can brands adapt to changing consumer needs? Mintel will soon publish the second edition of its Mintel Sustainability Barometer, which dives into these issues across 16 countries. And I'm delighted to welcome Richard Cope, the author of the barometer based in London, who has joined to give us a sneak preview of its findings. Hello, Richard.
Hi, Andrew.
Also joining the conversation today to add the North American perspective, we have Lisa Dubina from Chicago and Scott Stewart from Toronto. Welcome.
Hello.
Hi, Andrew.
Excellent. Welcome to the pod. Please introduce yourselves.
I'm a senior trends consultant at Mintel. I'm working out of the United Kingdom. I work a lot in macro trends and futurology, but I'm the author of the Sustainability Barometer, which I'll tell you a little bit more about later on.
Hi, I'm Lisa Dubina. I am an associate director here at Mintel. I write for the U.S. Culture and Identity Library, and I recently published the Sustainable Consumer Report here in the U.S.
Hi, I'm Scott Stewart, Associate Director of Lifestyles and Retail in Canada, and I recently published the Sustainable Consumer Report in Canada.
Great. Well, it's great to have you all for this important discussion. All right, so let's start at the very top by defining sustainability as a concept. Where does the term originally come from, and what is the background to the Sustainability Barometer?
Well, I think of the term way we probably all think about it at the moment in our business and people listening is this kind of idea around the triple bottom line and people thinking about sustainability across social, economic and environmental angles. But I think if we go back further, I start to look at where the origins of the word, going back to sort of the 17th century and stuff. And it kind of originates from the word bearable. I don't mean bearable in terms of something being annoying, but something you can support. Capable of being continued at a certain level was how it started to be talked about economically in the 60s. And I think that's key because I know we'll talk about this today, but, it's on every brand's campaign or website at the moment as a kind of sort of hygiene practice. But I think that practicality about it being about something which can be continued at a certain level, that practicality of it is really what it's about. And I think that's pertinent to a lot of the pressures we'll talk about today. As for the barometer, that's really about exploring things from the consumer angle. At Mintel, that's our core expertise is what consumers want and why. So what we're really trying to look at in the barometer is to track consumer attitudes, track consumer behaviors, understanding levels around that as well. And I think the value, the businesses of the barometer is really sort of identifying where they might need to educate consumers, where they might need to match certain priorities, and how they need to communicate things so they best resonate with them.
And so, this is the second year of the barometer. What changed? How are consumer attitudes evolving when it comes to sustainability?
Well, at the top line level, I think the thing that struck me most with the second wave is what I would call a kind of reality check. When we ask people about their biggest concerns, their priorities when it comes to the environment, what we've seen in the past is things like ocean plastic, very high up the agenda, waste and recycling in general, very high up the agenda. And we know that in terms of emissions, they're sort of lesser issues, if you like, compared to things around energy. And what we're seeing this time, I think, is a sort of reality check. We've changed priorities, things like climate change, global warming, water shortages, food shortages. They're really going up the agenda in terms of consumers' priority concerns. So I think the realities of climate change, disruptions to supply chains, tangible weather events and things like that seem to be impacting on what people are prioritizing, what people are concerned most about. That's been the most striking thing for me in terms of the data.
From a U.S. perspective, we're seeing in our U.S. data that U.S. consumers are continuing to pretty much fall behind other countries when it comes to engagement with sustainability. Only about 4 in 10 Americans consider living sustainably to be a top priority for them. So despite there being awareness of and concern about the climate crisis, most Americans are really doing the bare minimum right now. consumers are continuing to really think about living sustainably as a very challenging endeavor and one that's often fairly confusing. So they're really looking to brands right now to make sustainable living a more convenient and efficient option.
We're seeing something similar in Canada where there is a lot of confusion. 71% of Canadians say that they are a sustainable consumer, but when we look further into the data, they don't know exactly what that requires of them. So as a result, they are gravitating towards the simpler, more tangible and salient behaviors, throw out less, at this point, drive less, these kind of simple behaviors, and the more minimal the sacrifice to them personally, the more attractive it is, because to Richard's earlier point, it can be continued. It needs to be a sustainable behavior for them as well.
Yeah, so interesting because one of the most fascinating aspects of the barometer is these differences in attitudes and behaviors and how they vary, across the globe. For example, Canadians tend to be more optimistic about their ability to have an impact than Americans. Why do you think that is, and what are some of the more notable behavioral differences that you see across markets?
Yeah, it's interesting in Canada that not only is it that there's more optimism about having that impact, but when we look at the barometer, it also shows that they are more likely to feel that Canada is responsible for some climate change. So there's likely a connection between those two as far as the power and the responsibility. The question of why that is, it could be a political, cultural side. Our recent election last year, the Liberal government that won had climate change as a major pillar of its campaign. So that's reflective of the cultural change. And also, if we look at oil production as a per capita percentage of Canada's economy, it plays a bigger role, certainly in comparison to the US. So that might be more top of mind for Canadians as far as what we're doing to the environment based on our economy. And as a result, the responsibility feeling and then that empowerment to do something about it.
So you're saying Canadians are taking more responsibility for their impact on the environment?
They're more likely to say, to agree that their country is contributing to climate change. 48% agree with that based on the barometer compared to 39% in the US. So that cross-border comparison indicates that might explain the difference in the optimism about having an effect, because they think that they're doing something in the first place that they can potentially change.
I can almost hear Lisa and Scott doing their countries down a little bit, saying that, people are doing taking the easy option. They're looking for return on investment. They want things to be convenient. I mean, that's true across all the markets we're seeing. And I think, in the sustainability community, it's pretty well recognized that people are unlikely to buy products just because they're ethical or good for the environment. They still have to be convenient. They still have to be high quality. If they're going to succeed in the marketplace. And, I see the same thing here in the UK. I see the same thing across, when we ask people about a staple product like coffee, what considerations are most important when they buy it. Sustainability is pretty low down the agenda. You'll be lucky if one or two of the top 5 considerations are around sustainability, and it'll never be the top 1, 2, or 3 in terms of that. So yeah, that's what we see globally. It's the most popular behaviors are the ones which are simple, the ones which save money. The most popular sustainability behaviors are reducing consumption, things like buying fewer clothes, avoiding food waste. And that's the challenge going forward. People are only going to buy electric vehicles or change their home utilities if there's an ROI, and that's really what has to be sold in. That probably requires a lot of government help as well, of course.
The US continues to be very polarized when it comes to the idea of sustainability and climate change. There is still a significant segment of the population that really doesn't truly believe in this issue, or believes that it falls within the top even 5 top issues that we need to be concerned about right now. So I think that's where you're seeing more division and a little less engagement on the US side, is that, between political beliefs and other issues kind of competing for attention, the US market continues to be a bit divided when it comes to this issue.
Right. So we talked about some of these differences in optimism by market, but in general, are consumers feeling more or less optimistic these days? What does the barometer tell us?
There is a sense of time running out. So we have a statement where we ask people, if we act now, we still have time to save the planet, and the proportions responding positively to that are diminishing. It has actually gone up in Australia. And to build on Scott's point, we've obviously had a change of government there where policies around climate change were a big factor in that election. So that's interesting. But we needn't be that negative about declining optimism. I think it's natural we've got declining optimism. I mean, the COP26 event focused a lot of attention, probably for some people for the first time, on the scale of the challenges ahead, how we are behind schedule. Then you have the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reporting that, the shortfalls of where we are. Climate Action Tracker said we're on the road to 2.4 degrees at the moment. So when you hear this kind of stuff coming out in the media, it's natural people are less optimistic in terms of that. But, there are reasons for optimism. In this barometer, in the new wave of data, we are seeing increased desire. The proportions of people who want to have an electric vehicle, the proportions of people who want solar, the proportions of people who are reducing meat consumption, who are embracing micromobility, the proportions of people volunteering, all those things are going up, which does bring hope. I guess the thing at the moment is war in Ukraine is also something which is dimming optimism, and you get this every time something happens in sort of geopolitical tension level, you get lots of talk about sustainability being something too expensive for consumers. And I think, there's a lot of that happening at the moment. I think actually what's happening with war in Ukraine is kind of giving us a foretaste of the issues to come from climate change, and actually being more resilient is really the lesson which is coming from that, and a really strong argument for why individuals and governments should embrace sustainability. But we'll come back to that later, maybe on.
Yeah, I know. It's funny. It's interesting. Let's dig into that a bit more, because yes, you have seen clearly, yes, Ukraine is a factor, and you have seen some governments come out and make statements that they're going to try and do their best to sort of shift their policies and shift their reliance away from countries like Russia towards more sort of renewable energy sources. So let's dig into that a little bit further. So how do you each see the war in Ukraine impacting sustainability?
So currently in the US, we're seeing about 70 consumers say that inflation is currently one of their top issues of concern. And that's compared to only about a quarter who list climate change as one of their top 3 concerning issues right now. So we're just going to continue to see personal financial well-being be prioritized over climate change concerns. Whether that's, continuing to see higher prices in the grocery store, at the gas pump, we're really going to see financial practicality outweigh sustainable choices right now. And in the long run, that could, in a way, further delay widespread sustainability engagement among U.S. consumers.
We're seeing something similar in Canada with the same metric. 35% of Canadians say climate change is a top concern. That's compared to 43% who list world affairs, so it's a little bit behind at that, and 80% who picked inflation. So we can see where those priorities come through, and it makes sense that they'd be self-motivated. But at the same time, I think at a broader level, this could be a period where it at least shines a light on the complexity of sustainability for consumers. I mentioned that they prefer simplicity, but it's an incredibly complex topic. And it used to be just stop throwing things out and we'll be fine. We'll get rid of the landfills and then we're good. Now it's seeing how a geopolitical affair can affect prices and sustainability, and they're all kind of connected, and how consumers can play a role in that. So I do think the priorities might shift, at least in the short term, but there's at least, if I look at it optimistically, it might be an opportunity to shine some light and grow some awareness on how interconnected these all are.
That's certainly what we're seeing in Europe. There's definitely a short-term reaction, which is going to be relying more on fossil fuels and, suddenly upping oil production, whatever it might be. I think what's interesting, though, is that what you're seeing here is war disrupting supply lines or reducing people's access to sort of staple crops. And it's kind of a early distasteful lesson in what's to come from climate change. Because, if you look in the same year, I've seen data from the USDA in the United States saying that, parts of the country's wheat yield are going to be down 21% this year because of climate issues, nothing to do with war or conflict. And then longer term, you have the UN talking about, these big crop failures, which we sometimes see and have seen in the breadbaskets of the world. They're going to be sort of 4 to 5 times higher in the next decade in terms of their frequency. So it's a harsh lesson in what is to come from climate change. And I think at a consumer level, this, it's not just about less grain, less wheat. Consumers are going to learn things like the huge proportion of grain which actually goes to animal feed, for example. It's going to make people aware of things like that. So it could impact on attitudes to meat more. We're going to start using more palm oil because we're going to be deprived of sunflower oil, for example. So there's lots of knock-on effects. But I think the barometer, if you look at a country like Germany, which from the European perspective is a lot more fossil fuel dependent or fossil fuel friendly, certainly than France, which is very nuclear, or the UK, which benefits to a degree from nice climate for renewables. Only 39% of the consumers we've spoken to in the barometer agree that Germany should stop investing in fossil fuel energy. And you can understand the kind of relative weakness of that in the current climate. But the government's reaction to what's going on with the war in Ukraine has been to bring forward its target for getting almost all its electricity from renewable sources 15 years. By 2050, that was their target. They've now made it 2035. So they are in the short term, they're using more gas and things like that. But their ambition is to triple their additions of wind and solar going forward. So I think there's a lot of short term pain, but I think it's kind of sharpened the ambition of a lot of governments rather than blunted them to become more independent, more resilient, as I said earlier, to these kind of challenges. So I think you're going to see more local regional sourcing, more people trying to use renewables or possibly nuclear, if that's more realistic, to make themselves more independent. So I think in the short term, it's very problematic, but I think longer term, at least from the government perspective, it's a kind of lesson in the need to be more resilient and prepared for these shocks.
That's a really good point. In the US, we continue to see a lack of knowledge and understanding of these very complex sustainability issues being a main barrier to engagement in sustainability. This could be a great opportunity for consumers to get a real life demonstration of what are the realities that they will continue to face in the future if changes aren't made. So putting a positive spin there.
Excellent. All right. So consumer priorities might be elsewhere right now, but we're in the US. Certainly, we're entering fire and hurricane season, and extreme weather events will bring climate change to the forefront once again. I was reading the other day some staggering predictions for the 2022 fire season in the US. The estimate is some 72,000 fires burning 8.3 million acres. That's from the National Interagency Fire Center. I can't even get my head around that. To be honest. But the point is, we know these events are coming. I mean, insurance companies, for example, have to plan for them. So how should businesses be thinking about these extreme weather events?
Among U.S. consumers, the threat of extreme weather events is the top climate crisis concern, followed only by the risk of rising prices due to a lack of resources or supply chain disruptions. So I do think that's the most real world and personally impactful effect of climate change. And I think brands do need to tap into this fear a little bit, utilize it as motivation to make more sustainable choices. We're also seeing that the more climate crisis concerns consumers have, the more likely they are to be dedicated to living a sustainable lifestyle, which makes sense. So having brands kind of tap into these climate crisis fears, making these potential realities of climate change more personal, more relatable, I think could really impact U.S. consumers to take on more sustainability action and engagement in their personal lives.
I think at a general level, and obviously where I live, we're not getting quite the extreme weather events which you might get in the United States. And we've even had, Canada in terms of extreme heat waves. I mean, it's happening more to a degree in France and Italy in terms of heat waves and things. But I think all of this reinforces protection and self-preservation is a real driver behind action. So, consumers will start reacting to this just to protect themselves. One of my views on really is why the younger generations are so mobilized around this. It's not necessarily because they necessarily care more, or the more altruistic people or more environment. They're going to have to live with this. They're mobilized around these issues because they're going to, the second half of their lives are going to be spent coping with this. So I think protection, self-preservation is a driver. I mean, generally, there's a big correlation between sustainable behavior and healthy behavior, whether that's walking or running or cycling instead of driving, a very sort of prosaic example of that. I think, the other thing, which is, you might weatherproof your home or protect your home against the climate. There's an ROI on that as well. And it's that same spirit of health or, ROI, which needs pushing if we're going to sort of get more people to adopt leasing electric vehicles or, getting heat pumps installed in their homes or whatever it might be. It's that those drivers, this is going to be better for your health and it's going to be better for your finances if you embrace this. I think that's what I would take from all this at a general level.
It's interesting. Obviously the barometer, one of this sort of key theme that we're talking about today is some of this sort of change in behavior. The barometer has revealed this, as you described, Richard, this dimmed optimism, shift in consumer priorities. How should brands then adapt to those changes? Should they be adapting their strategies to those changing needs?
I think it's about frugality. As Scott's mentioned, Lisa's mentioned, these are the most popular behaviors. So you need to push sustainable behaviors as things which are going to save on resources for the environment, but are also going to save on you, save money as well. I think something else which comes through very strongly in terms of how brands can, position their strategies is the human element, because I think what we see from the data is people are much more likely to donate money to causes which have a human element rather than just a pure environmental element. So I think there's a challenge to kind of connect things which are beneficial to the environment with the human story behind that. By doing this, you're benefiting people and how it impacts on livelihoods. But I think that's something which is quite entrenched. I think where we have a challenge and where a lot of brands have a challenge is we are quite disconnected from the environment. We're continuing to urbanize, possibly less so in North America compared to the levels of population density in parts of Western Europe or parts of North Asia, but that's disconnecting us from nature. I went to a really good exhibition in London the other week, and they were just, making the case that, people need to make that connection, saying this glass of water you're drinking comes from a cloud, or that the breath of air you took came from the ocean. So I think brands and companies need to, help people make that connection to other people, connection to the environment. But I also think, a lot of things we've talked about is about things being tangible. One of the reasons people might be getting more concerned is they're seeing these extreme weather events. We need to make the solutions, I think, more tangible as well, and make them a bit more human so you can actually see them. That's why in my country, a lot of colleagues make fun that ocean plastic, I think in the UK, is like it's almost the number one cause, I think, a couple of years ago, which you think compared to climate change, that's ludicrous, right? But it's because people could see it and they felt complicit in it, and they could see there's a relationship between them and the packaging and the brands, and it's something they felt involved in. So I think there's lessons to be had from things like that in terms of how we can maybe mobilize against it.
We're seeing so many brands now, talk about their carbon footprint or make promises of carbon neutrality. Among U.S. consumers, these concepts are really too abstract and unrelatable right now. Similar to what Scott said, the most top of mind actions that come to mind for U.S. consumers are, recycling, reducing waste, things that are much more tangible. So I think brands really do need to find a way to make some of these bigger, more abstract, complex sustainability concepts bring it home to the consumer, like Richard was saying, make it more tangible, make it more personal, and really tie it back to how we are interacting with the environment day in and day out.
Yeah, that's a good segue, really. So, have you seen a particularly standout innovation from a brand in your respective markets that you think will really make an impact?
So one example in Canada that I think touches on what Lisa and Richard were talking about as far as tangibility and simplicity is a clothing brand called 10 Tree. And it's the brilliance is the simplicity, is that they plant 10 trees for every item you purchase from them. That's it. We can debate what the impact is actually going to be from 10 trees for every t-shirt. But from a consumer perspective, they know if I buy this thing, 10 trees will be planted. There's a feeling of responsibility in doing that. And I think, it touches on everything we've talked about. It also brings up something, I like Richard's point earlier about sustainability, kind of equating it to health, making it a sustainable practice, something that you can continue doing. It's easy to keep buying clothes that you like because you feel good about it. I kind of equate it to with a health thing, like Fitbit did so well because all they ask you to do is walk 10,000 steps in a day. They don't ask you to run a marathon once a week. So in doing something that people feel good and say, yeah, I can continue doing this, it makes it more likely that they're going to continue doing that. So something like that clothing company kind of strikes that chord.
Yeah, so it's simple, it's tangible, and it's achievable.
Yeah.
An example from the U.S., Patagonia Provisions partnered with the U.S. brewery Dogfish Head. They released an eco-friendly beer called Kernza Pills, and it utilizes this perennial grain called Kernza, and they did a really great job of explaining to the consumer how this new grain really pulls down carbon from the environment and traps it in the ground. They also explain how, it's a perennial grain, so it doesn't have to be planted and harvested annually, which means, it's more protection for the root system of the plant and protects the soil from erosion. So all of this is very much in that realm of abstract, not really top of mind to consumers, but Dogfish Head and Patagonia Provisions did a really great job of making this understandable to consumers through their social media videos. They had a really great Instagram campaign that talked about it and really broke it down and made it the idea of regenerative farming and agriculture much more understandable, and really explaining why it matters and how it's going to impact them.
I know we're going to talk about greenwashing and stuff in a bit, so maybe I'll talk about campaigns I've seen in Europe then. But I think not exactly brand action, but I think two of the things that have struck me most in Europe recently are some very kind of pertinent initiatives we're seeing from governments. So Emmanuel Macron got re-elected in the French election, and he got stung badly a couple of years ago with a kind of classic blanket fuel tax, which really hurt lower income people who are very dependent on vehicles, and had all the Gilets jaunes movement there. He's since responded to that with a scheme which would allow people, financially support people who qualified to lease electric vehicles. And I think that's a key thing. The idea of buying an electric vehicle doesn't make a lot of sense because it's going to be so out of date quickly, beyond the prohibitive cost of maybe purchasing one. So I think that's a really sensible scheme. We need to see more things like that. I guess something else which is pertinent at the moment is there seems to be a lot of innovation going on in North America, but also in Switzerland around energy storage. There's a company called Energy Vault, which is looking at sort of using gravity to store energy. So we have all these shortfalls at the moment brought about by disruption. And that's one of the few ways you can actually store things and actually sort of release enough energy and electricity to power people's homes. So some really kind of inspiring things happening in terms of innovation around that, and some good government policies. And hearing what Scott was saying about Canada, I mentioned Australia earlier. Clearly, there's some political shift happening around governments being elected based on this.
Yeah, it's interesting from a consumer perspective. It's difficult to know what's really going to have an impact and what is, to your point, Richard, greenwashing. Some of these innovations sound fantastic, and yet from a consumer perspective, like you say, Lisa, it needs to be fully explained, need to be explained in a way that consumers can understand it. But let's talk a bit about greenwashing. Which brands then have got sustainability right? Who's got it wrong? Are there sort of any particular pitfalls that brands need to watch out for?
In terms of the pitfalls, I would say brands need to be genuine. They know where their impact is. So if your impact is your energy, which it probably is, and a big proportion of your impact is probably down your supply chain, you can't be bullshitting people by just doing campaign which is all about your operational emissions, because they might be, if you're a retailer, they might be like 2 to 5% of all your emissions. So it's things like that. The one I always pull out and criticize and attack, my favorite one to attack, was the sort of Burger King campaign about feeding their cows lemongrass, and how they claimed it was going to, I think it reduced the emissions by a third, but they really were twisting the statistics, because they only talked about the emissions during the last 3 months, I think, of the cow's life, ignoring all the emissions from the feed in the first 18 months of its life. And just this is beside it having a horrendous kind of cutesy kids country and western video to accompany it, where they emerge from the cow's mouth and lots of fart jokes and stuff. And then if you look at the small print on the end, you talk about this innovation. You look at the small print on the ad. I mean, this is Burger King, right? This is an empire. It was only on sale at 5 restaurants in the world. So that was a terrible one. The other one I've been giving a kicking to is Mars Chocolate did some laudable packaging innovations where they reduced the amount of polymers and plastics in some of their packaging, talked about the benefits of that, but they did that age-old thing of the metrics were really insulting. They said that's the equivalent of 26 Tyrannosaurus Rexes worth of plastic we've removed. I mean, what kind of metric is that?
Oh my gosh, I'm squirming in my seat.
Yeah, it's insulting the consumer. You know, they need to tell us, you know, okay, what proportion of your plastic use is that? And I think, you know, to be positive, the good example I've seen, which picks up on a lot of what Lisa was talking about, is there's a tech reseller, tech refurbisher called Backmarket, which is a French company, which is trying to persuade people to get refurbed iPhones and things rather than buy a new one. And they've done a really good job of firstly marketing that as something which is you rebelling and not queuing up with the herd to get the new Samsung or the new Apple product. They've also communicated how much it's going to save you money. And then in terms of communicating the environmental benefits, they talk in terms of kilograms, they talk in terms of liters of water, and they really explain the impact you're having in context. So I think that's a really laudable campaign. And as you talked about right from the start, I'm hearing Scott and Lisa say, you know, consumers' priorities are about money, they're about convenience. That campaign acknowledges that, and it appeals to people's ego and desire to be individual before it starts pushing the environmental benefits. I think that's a really on the money campaign.
Yeah, so, I mean, there was a announcement yesterday from a bank in the US, TD Bank, which is famous for giving out pens in its branches. And they just announced that they're going to be producing those pens using recycled plastic. And of course, now they're pushing out a campaign around that. I'd love to get your take on that particular campaign.
Saving the world one pen at a time. What are they investing their money in is my question.
So it's one of those ones that's in the grey area, perhaps, right? Because, you know, you can't argue that that's not a good thing, that they're recycling plastic water bottles into the pens. But of course, like you say, it's not exactly going to have a huge impact on the environment.
Depends who they're bankrolling with their investments. I think, you know, it's no use taking those pens out of circulation if you're bankrolling fossil fuels or whatever it might be, which they might be. I'm not saying they are.
I was thinking that's also it's an interesting balance that brands do have to consider as far as the complexity of sustainability. Sometimes the most impactful things you can do are not obvious to the consumer. So then the question is, how do you communicate that ROI that you want to connect it? And then vice versa, the things that are particularly obvious to the consumer, like changing out the pens, might not actually be doing that much in the grand scheme of things. So if you keep doing that, sure, it might look great, but eventually somebody might call you out on it. So there's no easy answer to it, because it's how do you, a lot of it comes down to communication, like speaking in kilograms instead of T-Rexes. And how do you take that kind of back of house operational stuff and make that easily digestible for a consumer to understand? As an example of some transparency, but some challenge in communicating it in the tech industry. So Apple has their environmental progress report. So you can go on their website and it's available and has all the details on what they're doing. But it's over 100 pages long. So if you're really interested, and it's produced and published by them, so there's a little bit of potential bias in there as well that people have to consider. So it's moving in that direction as far as here, we're going to put the information out there, but is 100+ page PDF going to get to the average consumer and make them truly understand what they're doing? So a lot of it comes down to that communication and simplifying a very complex topic.
Yeah. I absolutely. It's a great point, and I think there's this sort of fine line between almost being exploitative versus being transparent. Sort of going back to some of our discussion around some of these extreme weather events. You know, usually brands step forward, of course, and they're helping local communities navigate, whether it's floods or fires or what have you. But in terms of sort of trying to roll out some sort of marketing campaign or strategy around these weather events, you could argue that that's somewhat exploitative.
Like Scott said, I think it's a tough lane to walk. You really got to, balance a lot of different considerations. More than anything, I think that it does come down to communication, and we need more brands to authentically step up and kind of put on the hat of educator. There's just so many knowledge gaps and lack of understanding, especially when it comes to, as I mentioned before, some of these more abstract ideas of carbon footprint and, net zero pledges. Those really don't resonate with consumers or mean much. So I think we really do need to see more brands find ways to help consumers digest these concepts, better understand how it's going to impact their daily life, and find a way to just, as Scott was saying, make these more resonating and understandable to consumers overall.
Lisa mentioned Patagonia provisions before. Obviously, they're more well known for their apparel, and there's a reason they are so fated as a sustainability brand, because they have always really respected their customers. So they never tried to talk about a product being sustainable, because it's not sustainable. It uses resources. It has an impact on the environment. So right from the off, they were sort of very open about if you buy one of our items of clothing, this is the impact of it. And, they had the Don't Buy the Jacket campaign, which obviously made them even more successful. They paid their consumers enough respect to explain why they use plastic packaging, why they were receiving the goods wrapped in plastic, and the impact of that, rather than the goods being damaged and all the resources going out to being wasted. So I think being respectful of your customers and educating them, and not just trying to blindside them, is, the thing we've got to hope more and more companies do. Because if they take other steps in the other direction to try and bullshit people, they're going to have to go back and address that later on and hold their hands up and apologize, because it's going to be revealed. All
right. So final question for each of you. So do you think we will achieve the COP26 target of net zero carbon emissions by 2050?
I'll answer that from at least a consumer perspective. It's a long way off, but I think I like Richard's alignment with the health motivations, and people need to see progress to continue doing something that might be difficult for them. So there's two ways to look at it. Either the consumer behavior needs to be so easy to change that they don't care about the progress, and that comes down to the simplification that we were talking about, or the progress needs to be so obvious that they're willing to continue that sacrifice. It's like getting in shape. You see yourself getting healthier, you'll continue doing that activity. So it's either an oversimplification of it, or it's making it even more tangible. One of those two things at least has to happen, I would say, to change behavior enough.
Well, basically, the IEA talks about 60% of those reductions we need to achieve are related to consumers. And I think we have the solutions there. We do have the tools to hit the target. So if we get enough smart government incentive schemes like the one I spoke about in France, if we get enough brands gravitating to renewables, more regionalization, embracing of nuclear as well, as you might see in nuclear energy, I'm talking about in relation to the crisis we're seeing at the moment, we have the tools to do it. So yes, we can do it if we embrace those areas.
I think it's definitely going to be a multi-pronged effort. It's going to require governments, the brands, and then also the consumer. And especially, as I've been saying with the U.S. consumer, I think so much of that comes down to educating and explaining to consumers the way that their behaviors are impacting the environment. So many U.S. consumers are very polarized on the idea of cutting back meat consumption. They don't see how that relates to the environment and sustainability. So, once again, I think really educating consumers, demonstrating how their behaviors are having an impact, and then showing the way that, making some of these concepts more tangible and showing how they can help improve not only the environment overall, but other aspects of their daily life, how it'll cut down on, extreme weather occurrences. I think all of that's really necessary and needed in order to inspire a true behavioral change among U.S. consumers.
Well, this has been extremely informative. I think there are many things that listeners can take away from this little conversation, but 3 things really resonated with me. Number 1, consumer priorities when it comes to sustainability are clearly changing, as we can see from the barometer. So from a brand perspective, it's about being aware of those changes and how it impacts your brand, your business, and within your respective market. Number 2, I think, a key word that you all referred to multiple times actually was this idea of making solutions tangible, making them relatable for consumers, particularly at a human level. I think you used that term, Richard, at a community level, and really connecting with consumers so that they don't have to, sacrifice, saving the environment for example, cost. And then number 3, that it's all about communication. It's about communication. It's about finding the right tone. It's about being authentic. It's about being respectful. It's about education. And that is not always the easiest thing to do, but clearly it's a top priority going forward. So with that, thank you, Richard, Lisa, and Scott. Thank you all for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure you subscribe, rate, and review us. If you want to know more about Mintel, who we are and what we do, head over to mintel.com and follow us on social media. We're on LinkedIn, Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook, and check out our blog for even more insights from our analysts. Bye for now.